Welcome to the ThinkData Podcast, and today I'm joined by Art Rivillis. He is the CTO and co-founder of Augment. They are the company behind augie, an AI teammate that is being built to automate complex workflows in logistics. I'm really looking forward to this one because we're going to really take a deeper dive and closer look how Augment is using artificial intelligence to help operators work faster and ultimately smarter. We're also going to take a closer look at what it takes to build reliable automation and also kind of the lessons Art's learned in scaling a tech startup from the ground up. They've raised a lot of money, they've grown exponentially, and also they are in a space that typically is deemed to and be seen quite slow moving and quite reluctant to change. So yeah, awesome to have you on today, Art. And as I mentioned at the top, you're obviously co-founder, CTO, wearing multiple hats, but for people that don't know your Augment, could you kind of summarize your journey and kind of what brought you to launch the business?
Yeah, so I've been in startups almost my entire sort of professional life. Out of school, I jumped into like a 2 to 3 person startup, and I kind of been in startups since my first foray into logistics was when I had joined a very small company. At the time, it was called Sneak Peek, but then changed its name to Symphony, and it was a company also founded by Harish, who is the CEO of Augment. And that was like where we kind of like was the first sort of dip into, the physical world. But in that business, we kind of had like an end-to-end product for brands, which was like, oh, we're going to do your kind of like D2C, product list page, product details page, basically kind of like your website hosting plus the fulfillment in one package for kind of mid-size enterprise customers. And the fulfillment we primarily outsourced. We didn't really think very much about it, and it wasn't so much a logistics company as much as like a SaaS business, but we were quite familiar with some of the challenges in operating a warehouse, and just by working with them.
Mm,
Out of that business, we had started Deliver, and the best way to describe Deliver is it's a real kind of like shipping business, right? So is like Amazon Prime for the non-Amazon world. So
okay.
Walmart, for Shopify, you would see a badge and a promise for when something would arrive to your door, and we would be, shipping products to your door within 1 to 2 days. Um, and that had a lot of interesting challenges because we had to, in order to ship something to you, it has to be ship something to you within 1 to 2 days and not spend a lot of money. It has to be
Mm,
really close to you, right?
yep.
So it cannot hit an airplane. It has to be by truck. And what that means is that you have to distribute the inventory close to the demand. And so you'll get a truck of, say, shoes. Let's pick that as an example. You need to understand, oh, okay, like these are sandals. And where is like, okay, if it's, like winter, maybe Florida's going to have a high demand for sandals. And like probably in like New York, it's going to
Mm,
be, Chicago is going to be really cold. They're not going to have a high demand for sandals.
makes
And
sense.
so we had locations all throughout the US, and we would effectively distribute that inventory based on the demand patterns that we were seeing and, close to the customer. So logistics business through and through. In there, we were effectively like a shipper. We
Okay.
used a brokerage, we had direct carrier relationships, and primarily for kind of local pickup and delivery to facilities, as well as distributing inventory, right? One node, and then you have is like a hub and spoke model, right? You have a hub, and you need to kind of send out trucks to all the different locations. And that was our sort of like first sort of introduction into the trucking world and like planning, like there's a bunch of like capacity planning, like, oh, you don't want to wait too long because then something is stocked out and it's not replenished, and then the customer's losing sales. But you don't want to like ship it immediately to the final destination and have a half empty truck, because then you're paying for the whole truck. And
Interesting.
that's going to be incredibly expensive. And so we did a lot of these sort of like optimization, we had a lot of these sort of like optimization challenges and learnings, which we then, basically folded into our kind of, into our understanding for the basis of Augment.
Interesting. So yeah, you obviously got that first real world understanding and some of the challenges. I think when we spoke in our kickoff call, it's actually from the US specific. There's lots of different, quite small logistics operators, and you're not necessarily just targeting the enterprise level here. But they're talking about there could be very small mom and pop type businesses which have been around for years. Or so for you, when you're targeting them and you're taking an artificial intelligence powered solution to maybe quite a traditional industry, and maybe people have operated in a certain way for so many years. How did you go about that from a messaging standpoint and just from an education perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like, it's one of the oldest industries, a very
Mm,
traditional industry.
yeah.
I would say like the one thing that I would say is that it's incredibly entrepreneurial.
Mm,
And one of the things that we had talked about was that, hey, there's like a million carriers in the US,
wow.
and a lot of them are small businesses, right? It's a handful of trucks, and there's maybe two or three routes that they'll run from two cities in the US, and that's the business.
Mm,
And almost like if you think about it, kind of like, kind of a original Uber in some ways, right? Like your ability to set your own hours, to work when you want to work, and, to have like really kind of, you're an entrepreneur, you kind of are in control of your own destiny. And that's very
mm,
freeing and very liberating. And whenever we think about kind of like, and I'm on the engineering side, so I'm definitely not the marketer in chief here. But when we think about positioning, and we think about kind of the early days of trying to like find fit, I think a lot of it comes down to like that there is sort of like, I think the easiest way to find fit is when the market is ready for it. A timing is really important. And I think there's a unique sort of for these properties of like you have a lot of entrepreneurs that want to be able to get an edge and to, be able to like, have the same staff but do more business, and and like be able to compete with others in the space, and to win more business so that they can grow, right? And
mm,
they tinker and experiment. Even though it's traditional, there's a lot of like tools in the market that serves this industry, and everyone's tinkering and experimenting, which I really love. I think the second piece is that, if we look at something like OpenAI, it's got, 800 million users, right? And we've kind of like it's it's kind of crazy because even if we think about like the internet, or we think about iPhone, when the first iPhone had come out, and we think of these kind of like technical trends, the adoption for for those two was not as dramatic as fast as what we're seeing with sort of adoption of like the Gen AI products. And so, and I think part of that is because they're inherently useful. People find, it's one of those things, thankful when people use something that they inherently see value in, they're going to like tell everyone they know, and then it just spreads much faster.
mm,
So anyway, so I think that is sort of the second piece, is that, folks recognize that this is something quite different and quite revolutionary.
mm,
And so if you're an entrepreneurial, business owner, and you are like, okay, I use this for other, maybe not for, like running my business, or like for any kind of like automation or anything like that, but I use it for like, I don't know, helping me with emails, or like summarizing reports, or helping me understand what this document's about, or what have you, right? Like you will want to see like, oh, what do I do with this? Like, how do I actually bring this in my business and
mm.
make it useful?
Yeah, it's interesting. So actually relating it to their real world examples where, AI is such a broad term now, but if you think about kind of where it came out and when ChatGPT was released, they thought actually that was when AI was launched, but AI has been around for years. And I think that's kind of the reality. It's become, on your point, more commercially accepted. People are just more like, oh, ChatGPT, oh yeah, that's AI. So actually, yeah, it's an interface into kind of this big search engine, really. And I think, yeah, I think it's really interesting. And what I'm keen to touch on is you talk about the journey of, it's about timing, and actually that coincides with the product, the technology, but also the uh, the world's kind of appetite to have a product like yours. When did you know? When was that light bulb moment when you thought, we've got something here? Product market fit is pretty clear. We've we've hit on something where people are happy to pay for it, because obviously it's all well and good having free trials, but the business, it's not a very good business model. When was that moment? And can you talk me through kind of subsequently what were the kind of initial challenges you had to overcome with that?
Yeah, I think I'll go for a little bit further, sort of further back in the journey, and I
Mm,
think that's kind of like, sort of our process on trying to find what we wanted to do and what the product could or should look like.
mm,
So I think when we were thinking, Harish and I were, initially, thinking about what could this look like or what should it look like. We were kind of had like two sort of like, I think, elements or that we wanted to connect. One was that, well, there's this technology shift. It's this revolution, and we wanted to build something that, at least was tangential or used some of this new technology, because it opened up all of these things. Like, previously you needed like large team of of AI, researchers and engineers in order to do some things that, these Gen AI models allowed you to do out of the box. And so we're like, okay, it's like you kind of similar to how, before before we had AWS cloud software, right? Like, people had to hire IT, and get racks. And
it's all
so
on.
the
What was that?
barrier to entry was very high, right? So if you're starting a software company, you need all this capital to buy hardware, right? And then set all that stuff up. And so the interesting sort of trend here is that it kind of created this democratization or access to vision products and like sentiment, intent, and like these things that were kind of like available in traditional models, but were much less accessible and harder to use. It made them a lot more accessible and lowered the barrier to entry, as kind of like previously, what we've seen in other kind of shifts like the cloud. So I think that was one, was that, okay, this is deeply interesting. We should do something
Mm,
that is connected to this. I think the second one was, we sort of made a contemplation. Do we do something, in healthcare, like healthcare? Do we do something outside of the space that we know? And uh, there's obviously a lot of developer tools. There's a lot of really cool businesses out there. And our sort of like, determination was like, where are we going to have an unfair advantage? Right.
okay.
An unfair
Yeah.
advantage you think about is like, oh, are there relationships that we can leverage that, if we were to come into a new space, like we wouldn't have nowhere to start, right? Are there conversations that we can have access to, just how do we learn as quickly as possible? And so we then focused on like, okay, like let's look at the merchants, because those were the customers that we had at Deliver. And so, like, okay, let's chat to some merchants. So we chatted with some merchants, and we were like, okay, like, interesting, but they have a lot of systems in place, and a lot of things are automated. So there's some things that we can build, but not substantial.
Mm,
And we were big users of freight. So we were like, okay, well, let's just, let's also talk to some freight companies, some brokerages. And that was kind of like, I think the big aha moment for me was, was going on site and just observing. We kind of had like maybe an inkling that that was the right space, but
the
we
hunch.
just weren't sure. So we went on site. We spent, 2 days with a business that became a customer, and just observing, just like, what do they do? And part of it is because there's one thing being a user of freight, right? Being a shipper. And then there's just another of like running the operations of a brokerage or a freight or
Mm,
a carrier. So we just sat and observed. And I think like what we found was, okay, like there's a lot of repetition, right? There's like some, we're shadowing this person who got like 1,000 emails a day and was insane. I have so much respect, like was able to stay on top of the whole thing. So anyway,
yeah.
we were like, okay, this is crazy. But there was a lot of like manual stuff. Oh, I copy and paste from here to here. And then, that kind of stuff. Or like, hey, it's the same question. I'm just getting the same question about how much, like how much you're willing to pay for this load. And I'm getting it like, the same question 50 times. And
Okay.
so we're like, okay, like this is quite interesting. We can save these folks just like a lot of time in doing this. We also recognize there was a lot of tribal knowledge. And
Mm,
so that really became kind of an influence on us, and like, oh, we have to capture this tribal knowledge. And so we then kind of came up with making these observations. We were like, okay, like, what if we had, kind of an autonomous employee, which was able to take some of the, like, not like the stuff that requires a whole lot of judgment, but the stuff that requires like, kind of low amount of judgment, right?
mm,
And we basically like, built sort of single purpose, like agent that, that is sits under this employee that's able to do this work and like help these folks just kind of get out of this kind of the stuff that's not fun or interesting in their day to day. We ran that by so we had this sort of like thesis. We did a little diagram. We ran it by the business owner, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting." And then we just, then we kind of did that with a couple of other customers, and they were all like, "Yeah, this is really interesting for us." And that's when we knew that we're like, "Okay, this is real."
Yeah, do you know, you're the first one. I've done a lot of these interviews. The first founder I've ever spoken to actually has talked about being on site, feeling it, looking at it, witnessing. Because a lot of these are, you do your interviews, you do your research, you do your, you do a lot of that kind of grunt work, but remotely. But actually, you getting there, feeling it, seeing it. Because I think what you don't see when you're doing a remote conversation is, as you say, the manual, putting the files away, all of the things that you think, actually, hang on a minute, we can remove those bottlenecks and we can actually increase efficiencies. And I think there's obviously a lot of people talking about displacement because of AI, but I see it another way. It's an opportunity to actually focus on the tasks you enjoy and become better at them and progress in different ways. So yeah, I think those people in that company are probably thanking you right now for removing that. I know as obviously a CTO founder, you've raised money, you've obviously hired, you've grown a business. How do you balance that? How do you balance the priorities? Because obviously with any organization, yes, it's great. So we've raised X amount of money and the world's good, but as a co-founder, as someone who's responsible for the technology side of things, how do you balance the two of leading, growing, working with your customers, and also keeping sane?
Yeah, if I figure it out, I'll definitely get back to you and let you know. It's super hard. It's
Yeah.
super hard. I think that the way that when I think about like money, I really think of that as like not the victory as much as it's like it just gives me permission, right, to focus on solving the problem that I'm set out to solve. And I think about like the balance of like, kind of like customer need and, kind of making the right technical choices.
Mm,
I think a lot of it comes down to investing in good leads that are, like that I trust in the business. And then from there, it's really about like, you know, spending. I think in any business, I think you always kind of, have a list of like, what are the things that keep me up at night? What am I worried about?
mm,
And it could be that maybe we haven't really figured something out, or maybe it's like worried about how this is getting executed, or that we're going to be really late on this project, or, what have you, right? There's many different sort of circumstances. And I think for me, a lot of it comes down to like, how do if I look through my week and I look at where I'm spending my time, I generally want to be spending my time on like, what are the things that I'm like worried about
okay.
that have to nail and get right.
Yeah.
And I put a lot of my attention on that.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think like on the that can be a complex sort of multi sort of like factor thing, which is like could be like I'm worried about it because I don't have the right product manager in place, or I don't have any product manager in place, or I'm worried about it because the engineering team's really new and they haven't onboarded yet, and so it can fork into, okay, the biggest problem is actually a recruiting problem, so I just need to spend my energy on that, right? Or the biggest problem is that, okay, we have the right people, but we need to make sure that we really align on like, how do we approach this problem? So I just need to spend like, sometimes I'll block out a week and I'll be like, this week I am just going to laser focus on making sure that we're approaching this in the right way. Um, and so that's typically the way that I will balance my time. And so it's very much just kind of like, you know, very quickly growing, crazy startup environment, kind of jumping on things, ranking a list, and then jumping on things that I think are where my time and attention can benefit the work. I never want to be I never want to like be in the middle of something where I'm like, okay, I'm not adding anything here.
It's a fair point. I think you also raised one of the most valid point founders sometimes overlook is the importance of that first layer of hiring and actually those lead profiles that can remove or not so much remove, but allow you to focus on other priorities. And actually letting go is is a founder's probably biggest challenge because it's your baby. You put blood, sweat, and
Yeah.
tears and capital and everything on the line for this. So are you a remote business? Is there an in-office or is everyone based across the US?
We have both. So we have an office in San Francisco, an office in Toronto. There's a non-technical office in Chicago, and then we have remote folks as well.
And how do you find that from a logistics standpoint of bringing that culture and cohesion together? How do you balance that? Because I know a lot of startups, they want to be in an office, but from a talent standpoint, they feel it restricts them. But I'm intrigued. How do you continue building that culture remotely?
Yeah, it's it's tough. The way that we try to organize teams is that we try to so if someone's working remotely, then they work with other folks that are working remotely. And if someone's in office, then they work with other folks that are in office. Because if someone's coming into the office, we want to get them the benefit of being in the office versus just doing calls all day. We haven't done that perfectly everywhere, but that's the aim. I mean, I think with culture, it really comes down to being present and then
Mhm.
identifying like we have a set of operating principles. And and there's these are I would say kind of foundation of the culture within the business. That's things, for example, like, be an owner, right? Like if you're doing something, you gotta just take that end to end, don't kind of take it halfway and then, okay, someone else is going to take over the rest, and really feel like it's the business. You're not an employee in the business. You're part owner of the business, because it's true.
Yeah,
And then,
like that.
things like being honest and direct. Like if something's broken, say it's broken, speak truth to power, make it be known, right? Like try to focus on fixing it, focus on the solutions. And then, and like, don't think about things at the surface level, think about them deeply, right?
Mhm.
And I think that where that ends up happening is I always think of specifically within engineering. I think that, like, for myself, I can't be in every meeting and every kind of in every place. So what ends up happening is that I need to be super crystal aligned with, whoever's reporting to me, like the engineering manager, the PM that's reporting to me. We need to be crystal aligned on, like, how do we operate? What are the priorities? And some of that is passive. Like I look in Slack and then I'm like, and then there's some correction, or some of it might be we're in a meeting together and there's some correction. And I typically go back to the operating principles. That's usually what I will focus on. But that's kind of where the sort of the alignment happens. And then it's really then up to like the lead in that case to go and then kind of forward sort of like implement that alignment with their
Mhm.
team. Right. And so that's how I think of, like, I think one of, kind of like the core responsibilities of management is actually to make the culture within kind of using the tree structure, make the culture within the organization consistent. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I can agree more. And I really like your point about people, if they're in office, should be trying to collaborate with people in office. I find it farcical that you have an in office person dealing with someone who's remote when they're thinking, hang on a minute, I'm in an office. And yeah, I really like that. And I think it goes back to my point earlier about that, empowering that kind of second layer of leaders, and they empower their team. So then you have
Right.
a self perpetuating motion where your role is, as you said earlier, going to the priorities that you need to focus on. Final question for you in terms of AI, logistics. You've obviously seen a huge amount of change in the last 4 or so years of when you launch, when you've grown. What, if you had your crystal ball based on the feedback you're seeing, what advancements specifically within AI do you think we're going to have that's going to transform logistics, both US but also globally?
I mean, I think that there's a couple of things that uh I see would get better with time. And this is just kind of extrapolating kind of like current improvements, right? So like, like and there's a couple of categories of models. And I think that, like, I think we've done a good job with the kind of current generation of models, but I think the better the models get, the easier it is for us to do our job. And so, there's a bunch of things here. So like one is, we do voice calls. So voice calls are hard because there's detecting turns, there is transcription, there is speech synthesis, things like that.
Mm,
And those models have gotten better over time. And I think the better that those models get, the better quality these calls are going to become, right? Because you'll be able to, like, oh, if it's like really hard to understand what you're saying, you would actually do a better job than I think the current gen of models. And then also, like, the synthesis will be more realistic, more human. Right now, it's kind of slightly uncanny valley. I think the other piece that's quite important in logistics specifically is kind of like like document process. No standardization of any kind of document. So there's this like document entity extraction, and I
okay.
think that, like, as the models themselves get better, that also becomes easier and can be more accurate and more consistent. The piece that I'm excited about for, for Augment and how we kind of play into the story here is that given that the industry is really fragmented, the current sort of like way of stitching everything together is, through AI, right? And I think like we're playing a big part of that. And one thing that I'm quite excited about is that if you have, an augie with, within the network,
Mm,
right? The network of all the, like there's the shipper has an augie and a broker has an augie and a carrier has an augie, then you can actually start without having to do integration. You can start sharing data if two respective nodes in the network actually work together. And you don't have to go through text and, which is sometimes fallible and inefficient and expensive.
mm.
You can actually go and have a direct, connection and share data in a high fidelity real time way as it's happening, which I think is, you know,
That's
really
intelligent.
attractive for the industry. So that's one of the things that I'm, particularly excited about.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. Look, it's been hugely interesting. I think when we had the initial briefing, you talk about logistics. You think, well, actually, the way you've explained it, there is that light bulb moment. Certainly for me, and I'm sure the listeners here will want to check you guys out. Take a look at Augie. Take a look at Art's background. But yeah, thanks so much. It's been super interesting. And as I say, you're disrupting a space and adding huge amount of value to a space that may previously been overlooked. But on your point, what, 1 million trucking companies? It's a huge market, huge TAM, and no surprise you've had the success you've had. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Art.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks again. Thanks.